as we move forward with Lent, I just want to invite us to all take a really big breath in and out. That is how I always feel about Lent. Like I need to start with a big preparation breath. Over the course of the Christian year, the season of Lent exerts perhaps the greatest gravitational pull for worship planners, preachers, and the congregation. Though it is obviously not nearly as long as ordinary time, the Lenten journey to the cross, culminating with the crucifixion and burial of Jesus in the tomb, influences the orbit of our faith journeys, reminding us year after year that at the center of the Christian life is the crucified and then risen Christ. So when we set out to write a sermon guide for Lent, the goal was to bring together a significant public health topic that could also illuminate and be illuminated by the journey that Jesus takes towards the cross. Using the lens of trauma and resilience, our Lenten sermon guide, Naming Trauma and Practicing Resilient Love, invites congregations to hold trauma and resilience in tension, refusing to erase the impacts of trauma on our lives while also learning how to practice resilient love from Jesus's teachings and actions, including his crucifixion and resurrection. In the guide, you will find sermon materials and liturgical elements for all 6 weeks of Lent, as well as Good Friday and Easter. In the first 2 weeks of Lent, the guide explores how we define trauma and resilience. The remaining 4 weeks of Lent focus on 4 specific areas of communal trauma: economic hardship, relational wounds, environmental insecurity, and divisiveness. For Good Friday, there's a service adapted from a traditional service of Tenebrae that focuses on the trauma of communal violence. The series concludes on Easter Sunday by exploring Christ's resurrection as God's resilient response of love in answer to cyclical trauma. Each week, the focus scripture is a gospel text assigned to the season of Lent or Easter by the Revised Common Lectionary. Though we pull from years A, B, and C of the lectionary, it was important to us that we use texts that congregations often engage during the Lenten season. None of the scriptures then are seen as out of place or unusual to hear during Lent. Throughout the guide, we define trauma as, quote, exposure to an incident or series of events that are emotionally disturbing or life-threatening, that has lasting adverse effects on an individual's mental, physical, social, emotional, and or spiritual well-being. Using this definition of trauma, one of the goals of the entire sermon guide is to identify and name trauma and the messy, irreversible toll it takes on individuals and communities. Where so many of us have been told that we need to forget or push through our trauma, this sermon guide encourages all of us to come alongside and learn from Jesus as someone who also experienced trauma. Because living into God's good news requires the honest recognition of trauma in the world. Once we've honestly named trauma, we can give and receive resilient love with God, with ourselves, and with our neighbors. Resilient love is the love that brings forth life in the face of adversity, life for you and life for your community. Where resilience is strength forged through adversity, Jesus shows us that love makes resilience possible. It is a particular kind of love that meets suffering and trauma head on and insistently reminds us that God keeps loving us and keeps working for our well-being. I don't know about you, but that is good news to me. Building on these understandings of trauma, resilience, and resilient love as we move through Lent, the series culminates with Good Friday and Easter. If I could be honest, we debated whether we were going to include Good Friday and Easter, and yet we felt it was incredibly important to help all of us take this journey to the cross and actually reach it together, and then experience the surprise of resilient love's resurrection at Easter. So we offer a fully fleshed out Tenebrae liturgy for Good Friday that links the story of the crucifixion to modern day experiences of communal violence. In response to Good Friday and to the larger journey of Lent, the Easter liturgy and sermon guide uses Luke's account of the women at the tomb to explore the resurrection as God's resilient, eternal response of life in the face of death-dealing trauma. Thus, Easter brings the sermon series to a close with an invitation to work toward participation with God's resilient love in the slow, persistent work of bringing forth and sustaining life whenever and wherever we encounter suffering, hardship, and trauma in our communities. With that overview of naming trauma and practicing resilient love, I want to invite Dashanika Poindexter to come and share with us about a particular part of this sermon guide that she wants to bring to the fore and make sure we have a chance to sink our teeth into.
Yes, thank you so much, Lisa. I am so excited to be here with you all today. Again, I am Dashanika Poindexter. I'm the program coordinator here at the Health Fund, and I've been on staff for about 3 years now. Some of you guys I have talked with, and we have sent emails, and so I am so excited to be able to just talk a little bit more about this sermon guide and focus on particularly week 4 that focuses on relational wounds. At the Health Fund, we describe relational wounds to be long-term chronic stress caused by repeated violations of personal boundaries, betrayal, rejection, and confusion that produces a sense of lack of control and/or helplessness. In society, relational wounds can look like racism, misogyny, bigotry, and other forms of discrimination, physical or verbal violence, violated boundaries, disrespect, and threats on basis of race, ethnicity, gender, disability, or any other forms of difference results in relational wounds of trauma. And so I'm actually coming back here to work from vacation. My mom was able to visit me for the first time. I'm originally from California. And so we was able to come to Kansas and visit, and also take a quick drive to Tulsa, Oklahoma. And so I want to just share my experience in Tulsa, and then redirect us back to Kansas, and hopefully give you guys some practical ways that you can practice resilient love after relational trauma. So as I said, recently I was at the Greenwood District, famously known as the Black Wall Street in Tulsa, Oklahoma, with my mom, as you can see us right here together. Now, quickly, the Greenwood District was a community of great possibilities and prosperity built by Black people. There were places of worship, places to live, places to learn, shop and play, and places to worship. In May 1921, this community was taken over by flames by a heavily armed white mob of looters and arsonists. One factor that drove this violence was resentment towards Black prosperity found in Greenwood. On this next picture here, you see a plaque with the names and the businesses and the homes that were lost during this racial violence. And you see the financial claims of about $2.8 million. Today, that will be worth about $27 million. What took years to build was erased in 24 hours by racial violence, and over 300 African-American lives were lost, homes, businesses, legacy, and generational wealth that might have shaped and secured the fortunes of Black children and Black grandchildren. This is an example of racial trauma that took place right next door to us in a state right next door to us, and one that really impacted my mom and I when we visited. Now, we weren't there physically in 1921, okay? And yet, by being a part of the larger Black community, it still brings up feelings of anger, pain, and hurt. Can you go to my next slide, please? This is a picture that I took at the Greenwood Museum. And as you see here, there's a quote by James Baldwin that says, "To be Black and conscious in America is to be in a constant state of rage." And they have some more words here. What are your triggers when dealing with historical racial trauma? Because trauma can really weigh heavily on the body. And I think that's why it's important that Lisa put this in the sermon guide, because, you know, things that have happened in the past can still have real impacts on communities and individuals today. Now, we can leave this slide up here while I continue to talk about something else here in Kansas. An example that you all might be more familiar with would be a community called Nicodemus. In Nicodemus, Kansas is in Northwest Kansas. Is there anybody representing from the Northwest? You can put like a thumbs up. I've never been, but maybe some of you all have. Well, Nicodemus, Kansas is the only remaining Western town established by African Americans during the Reconstruction period following the Civil War. Between the end of the Civil War and the 1880s, many courageous Black settlers sought better lives, better land, and better opportunities in the heartland. Similar to the Greenwood District, Nicodemus has been met with opposition. However, organizations like the Kansas Black Farmers Association emerged out of the community's efforts to come together to remove sources of discrimination that affected minority farmers financially, physically, and emotionally. I share these two stories as examples of relational trauma experienced in communities and how trauma can be, again, long-term. But I don't want to leave you there, because this sermon guide also talks about resilience. And I want to make sure that I leave you pastors and lay leaders with some ways that you can make big or small impacts. Some ways that I have seen healthy congregation churches make an impact is through educational awareness. And I know that educational awareness is a big topic right now, but I have seen churches do book clubs, creating safe spaces for learning about these types of historical events, creating safe spaces to ask questions, and really just explore, racism in their community, or just different types of topics that may seem scary for some if it's their first time learning about these things. And some books that I recommend for a book club would be The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander. I also recommend Jesus and the Disinherited by Howard Thurman. And I also recommend The Cross and the Lynching Tree by James Cone. Another way that you can make an impact is by supporting or partnering with organizations who are already doing the work, like the Kansas Association of Black Farmers. Sometimes we want to reinvent the wheel, but there are organizations who are out there already doing this good work, and who would, love to have your support and an extra hands on the field, right? Also, my last point is learning to be an intentional community with your neighbors. We have a special grant opportunity called the Good Neighboring Experiment that seeks to prepare congregations with practical tools churches need to forge more meaningful relationships and to create sustainable impact in their community. Building intentional community with your neighbors is another way that you can learn about these events and learn about how they affect your neighbors and the people in your community. I think it's I think it kind of brings a more of a personal way to learn about these events and to know someone who is dealing with them and someone who may need extra support. So that's another way that you can make a small or a big impact in your congregations and communities. Thank you.
Dashanika, thank you so much for sharing that with us. Dashanika really helped us. I mean, she's helping with all of these. This is very much within what she does within the Health Fund as well. But I really was appreciative for her bringing us the story of Nicodemus, Kansas, and the work that's being done there. And whether you want to call it coincidence or you want to call it the Spirit at work, it just so happened that we also had slated the story of Nicodemus and Jesus from John chapter 3. So that just it just kind of came together in the sermon guide, and that's I don't have favorite weeks, but if I did, that is one of my favorites and how it came together. So thank you so much. And we have about 4 minutes for some questions about what you've heard from me or for Dashanika. So if you want to use the reaction button, I will call on you to unmute and share your question with us.
Oh, interesting.
Okay. Since there aren't any more questions for right now, I will go ahead and move us back into our next free writing practice. Encourage you to pull out that piece of paper or your document. Again, thinking with the question once again, specifically with this sermon guide, what have you heard that is most important for your congregation to hear in the coming year?